All right, I want to bring in former FBI profiler Mary Ellen O'Toole. Mary Ellen, thank you for being with us. You worked with the Elizabeth Smart and Natalie Holloway disappearances, among countless other big cases. You spent your career studying the criminal mind. When you look at that video, what stands out to you?
Tucson, Arizona, February 1st Street, 2:28 in the morning. Most of the city is asleep. The streets are quiet, the kind of quiet that feels normal until it doesn't. And then a doorbell camera catches something. A figure, masked, deliberate, moving across the property of a woman named Nancy Guthrie with the kind of slow, measured confidence that does not belong to someone who stumbled there by accident. A backpack on their back, gloves on their hands, every movement calculated, every step placed with intention. That footage would become the most studied image in this entire investigation. That figure would become the face of a case that gripped millions of people across the country, a case that began with a woman who left a family dinner on January 31st and never came home. Nancy Guthrie, a mother, a woman who had lived in that same Tucson home since the 1970s. Decades of life built inside those walls. Decades of routines, of neighbors, of familiar faces passing through. And one daughter who, every single morning, sat in front of millions of Americans on the Today Show. Savannah Guthrie, a face the country knew, a name attached to a life that felt public, visible, known. But Nancy's life was quieter, private. Tucson, the home she had kept for decades. Hi viewers, here is a question and the answer will genuinely shape how this story lands for you. Before today, did you believe the man caught on that doorbell camera was still out there hiding somewhere, yes or no? Drop it in the comments right now because what comes next is going to completely change how you answer that question. For 3 months, one assumption held everything together. Find the man on that porch. Find the answer. It was not an unreasonable assumption. It was the only visible thread in a case that left almost nothing else to pull.
In your professional opinion, looking at this video, does it look like this individual had scoped out the home before?
Well, it's the comfort level on the outside that seems to be really impressive to me. But I have seen in other cases involving kidnapping, even though it's not kidnapping for ransom, it's kidnapping as part of another major crime, that offenders go into the house of a low-risk victim in a low-risk environment before the night or the day of the kidnapping so that they know what the layout of the house is.
Law enforcement built around it. Media coverage circled it. A reward, climbing past $1.2 million, was structured specifically to bring that person forward. And the public, millions of people who had followed every update from the very beginning, stared at that same masked face on that same piece of footage, looking for something in it, some detail, some recognition, some crack in the image that would explain what happened to Nancy Guthrie. For 90 days, that face was the center of everything. Wanted posters, federal involvement, tips pouring in from across the country. And still, nothing. The figure stayed nameless. The case stayed open. And the question that everyone was asking, who is the man on that porch, remained unanswered in a way that started to feel less like a delay and more like a wall. Something wasn't adding up, because here is what trained investigators understand that public coverage often misses. When a crime is planned at a certain level of sophistication, the piece you can see is rarely the piece that matters most. The visible element, the figure caught on camera, the detail the world fixates on, that is not always the center of the story. Sometimes it is the outer edge of it. The part that was always meant to be found, while the part that actually matters stays completely out of frame. That idea would sit quietly in the background of this case for 3 months. Unspoken, unconfirmed, too significant to say without the weight of evidence behind it. Until May 6th. On May 6th, a group of profilers sat down with this case.
Savannah Guthrie posted another video on her Instagram yesterday, and it was interesting. It was just her looking into the camera. You could see she put on a little bit of makeup as well. And this time she was pleading to the public for help, not her mother's kidnappers. What do you make of this strategy behind these social media videos, and specifically the timing?
Not casual observers, not armchair analysts, professionals whose careers were built inside the architecture of violent criminal behavior. People who had spent decades learning how these crimes are constructed, how they are planned, who plans them, and what the planning itself reveals about the person behind it. And one of them said something out loud that nobody in 3 months of public coverage had been willing to say. Dr. Ann Burgess. The name matters. Because Dr. Burgess did not arrive at this case as an outsider looking for attention. She arrived as the researcher whose work on violent criminal behavior formed the foundational framework that the FBI uses to profile offenders. The science of criminal profiling, the systematic, documented, evidence-based approach to understanding how dangerous people think and move, that science exists in the form it does today in large part because of what Ann Burgess built. When she speaks about a case, investigators listen. Not out of courtesy, out of professional recognition that what she sees in a behavioral profile is not a guess. It is a map, and on May 6th, she looked at the map of this case and said the man on that porch, the only face this investigation had shown the world for 90 days, may already be dead. Let that settle for a moment. Not hiding, not running, not sitting somewhere watching the reward climb and deciding whether to turn himself in. Gone, and not gone by accident. Gone by decision. Gone because someone made a calculation, a cold, specific, deliberate calculation, that the risk of leaving him alive had become greater than the risk of removing him. Brian Entin pressed her directly. Could Porch Guy be dead? She confirmed it. Killed by whoever sent him? By the boss? She confirmed that too. 90 days. $1.2 million. Millions of people staring at the same face. And the answer was never in that footage. It was always behind it. Dr. Ann Burgess did not use dramatic language when she said it. That is the part that stays with you. She did not theorize. She did not speculate with the kind of cautious distance that analysts use when they are not fully committed to a conclusion. She answered the question directly, without hesitation, the way someone answers when they have already done the work and the work brought them to a place they cannot walk back from. Brian Entin asked. She answered. And what she described was not a theory about a frightened accomplice who panicked and ran. What she described was something colder than that, something more organized, more deliberate, more revealing about the kind of person who built this crime in the first place. She said the man on that porch may have been eliminated, not arrested, not in hiding, eliminated, by the same person who positioned him there on February 1st at 2:28 in the morning. By the same person who chose him, briefed him, sent him, and then watched the entire world start hunting for his face. Think about what that decision requires. It requires someone who does not operate on emotion. Someone who looks at a situation the way an engineer looks at a structure under stress and identifies the weakest point with complete detachment. The masked figure on that doorbell camera was not just an accomplice in that moment. He was a liability. The moment that footage went public, the moment law enforcement named him as the primary target, the moment $1.2 million was placed on his identification, he stopped being useful. He became the single thread that, if pulled, would unravel everything. And the person who built this did not build it to be unraveled. Dr. Gary Brucato gave this architecture a name. He called it a spiderweb. And that image is not poetic language. It is a precise structural description of how this crime was designed. A spiderweb has a specific logic. The outer threads are the most visible. They are the most exposed. They are built to catch, to hold temporarily, to absorb the contact from the outside world. But they are not where the spider lives. The spider lives at the center. Patient, still, connected to every thread, aware of every vibration across the entire structure. But never, not once, directly visible from the outside. The man at Nancy Guthrie's door was an outer thread. Visible from the first moment. Exposed by a camera he may or may not have known was there.
It was very well done, and I'll tell you why. She is appealing not to the general public. She is appealing to one person. She is appealing to that one individual that has information about this offender that may be too frightened, maybe too intimidated to come forward, but knows or strongly suspects that their family member, their neighbor, their coworker is responsible. All it takes is one person to come forward and to say, here's why I suspect this is the person responsible.
Studied by millions of people who believed, reasonably, that finding him meant finding the answer. He held the world's attention for 90 days. And if Burgess is right, he was gone long before any of those 90 days had passed. That is not a small detail. That is the entire shape of this case redrawn. Because if the outer thread has already been removed, then what remains is the center. Intact, connected, watching this investigation the same way it has watched everything from the beginning. From a position that nobody has photographed. Nobody has publicly named. Nobody has placed on a wanted poster or attached a reward to. A position that looks, from the outside, completely ordinary. And this is where Dr. Burgess's conclusion stops being a profile and starts being something more urgent. Because the boss, the person at the center of this web, did not become invisible by disappearing. They became invisible by never appearing in the first place. They are not hiding in the shadows. They are standing in the light, living a life that looks unremarkable, occupying a space in someone's world, maybe multiple people's worlds, as a person who would never cross anyone's mind in connection with something like this. That is the armor. That is what has kept them protected for 3 months while the world looked at the wrong face. And the question that unlocks the next layer of this case is the one that Dr. Casey Jordan answered on May 6th. Not who is the boss, but how did the boss get close enough to know what they needed to know? Because this crime required specific knowledge, not general information, not something available through a search or a news article. Specific, intimate, operational knowledge. The layout of Nancy Guthrie's property, her daily patterns, her schedule, the fact that she lived alone, the entry points on that property, the rhythms of her life that would only be visible to someone who had spent time in or around that environment. That kind of knowledge has a source, and the source is proximity. Dr. Casey Jordan identified the category of person who could have acquired that knowledge without triggering a single alarm. Not a stranger who forced their way into Nancy's world. Not someone who stood out. Someone who blended. Someone whose presence in that environment was not just accepted but expected. An Uber driver, a delivery driver, a maintenance worker, a service professional of any kind. Someone who passed through Nancy Guthrie's world in a role that made them background. Part of the scenery, a face that registered briefly and then dissolved into the ordinary texture of daily life. Nancy Guthrie had lived in that Tucson home since the 1970s. Let that number sit for a moment. Decades. Decades of people with legitimate reasons to be on that property. Plumbers, electricians, delivery drivers, landscapers, repairmen, caregivers, contractors. A long, quiet, unremarkable parade of faces that came and went without leaving any significant impression. Because that is how ordinary life works. People move through our spaces all the time and we do not study them because we have no reason to. But one of them had a reason to study Nancy. Somewhere in that decades-long list of ordinary interactions, one person was not ordinary at all. One person was paying a different kind of attention. Building a picture, noting the details, storing the information that would later become the operational framework for what happened on February 1st. And they did it in a way that felt like nothing. That is the skill, not the crime itself. The approach, the patience, the ability to occupy a space with a specific, hidden intention while appearing to have no intention beyond the obvious one. Fix the pipe, deliver the package, tend the yard, leave, and carry every useful observation out the door with you like it weighs nothing at all. Jordan added one more dimension to this that most coverage has not fully absorbed. The boss may not have come to Nancy directly. They may have come to her through Savannah, through the visibility of a daughter who appears on national television every morning in front of millions of people. Someone who watched the Today Show and saw not just a journalist, but a
electricians, HVAC workers. Every person who had legitimate reason to enter Nancy Guthrie's home in the weeks and months before she vanished is now under the microscope. And one detail in particular has drawn attention from forensic analysts.
Connection, a thread that led somewhere private, a door into a world that felt, from the outside, completely reachable. Think about what that means. Savannah Guthrie's public life, her career, her face on that screen every morning, may have functioned as the original point of access for whoever planned this. The public visibility of a daughter used as a map to find the private life of her mother. And Nancy Guthrie had no way to see that coming. Nobody would, because the wolf in sheep's clothing does not announce itself. That is the entire point of the disguise. Dr. Brucato chose those words with precision. A wolf in sheep's clothing does not look dangerous. It looks like something you recognize. Something you trust. Something whose name, if you heard it attached to this crime, would make you stop and say that cannot be right. I know that person. That person is completely normal. Because they built normal. They constructed it deliberately, maintained it consistently, and wore it every single day as the most effective form of protection available. That is who has been watching this case for 3 months. And the people closest to them have already seen something. They just do not have the framework yet to understand what they are seeing. Here is where the investigation itself becomes part of the story. Because the behavioral evidence of what the boss did after January 31st does not exist only in the past. It exists right now, in the present tense, in the behavior of someone who is currently living inside the tension of knowing what they know while maintaining the performance of someone who knows nothing. Robert Clemente, whose background in behavioral analysis spans decades of work with law enforcement, described exactly what that tension produces. He said that because this person was not a professional, not someone trained to compartmentalize at the level of a career operative, they exhibited behavior before and after this crime that the people around them would have noticed. Changes in routine, shifts in how they carry themselves, reactions that arrive at the wrong moment or with the wrong intensity when this case comes up in conversation. A quietness that is different from their usual quietness. A distance that was not there before January 31st Street. A performance that is, by nature, exhausting. Because performing ordinary is not the same as being ordinary. And the gap between those two things, however small, however carefully managed, produces exactly the kind of behavioral fractures that the people closest to someone eventually feel even when they cannot name what they are feeling. They sense something shifted. They notice something is different. They do not know yet what they are noticing. But somewhere in this case, in the immediate circle around the person who planned this, someone has already felt that shift. Someone has already had a moment of quiet unease that they cannot fully explain. A conversation that felt slightly off. A reaction that did not quite match the situation. A detail that sat in the back of their mind without a category to file it under. That person is the key. Not the DNA. Not the footage. Not the reward. A person who is living their ordinary life right now with a feeling they cannot yet name, sitting on information they do not yet know is information. And now the framework exists to help them recognize what they have been carrying. But before that framework could be fully applied, before the behavioral map could be built and the threads could be followed to the center, something had to be corrected. Something that had been quietly fracturing this investigation from the inside since the very beginning. And when it finally came to light, the only word for it was failure. Brian Entin confirmed it on the record. In the early weeks of this investigation, the Pima County Sheriff's Department was not fully sharing evidence with the FBI. Information that should have been in federal hands during the most critical window of any investigation was not. Leadership changes within the sheriff's office had placed less experienced personnel in positions of authority at precisely the moment when experience mattered most. Decisions were made, or not made, that slowed the transfer of critical materials. And evidence, including forensic evidence that had been collected at Nancy Guthrie's home, sat in a private laboratory in Florida instead of an FBI facility where it could have been processed with the full resources of federal law enforcement. A forensics professor who reviewed this case said publicly that it will be taught in classrooms for years. Not as a model, as a warning, as a documented example of institutional failure during a high-profile investigation. That is not a small thing to say. That is a professional assessment from someone whose entire career is built around the science of what law enforcement does right and what it does wrong. And the word they chose was failure. Every day that evidence sat in that Florida lab instead of federal hands was a day the threads were not being pulled. Every day the communication between the Sheriff's Department and the FBI remained fractured was a day the outer edge of this case stayed intact while the center breathed easier. The boss, whether they were tracking the investigation consciously or simply feeling its pressure ease around them, moved through that window. Weeks of time, weeks of evidence sitting still. And then the window closed. The DNA collected at Nancy Guthrie's home, including a hair sample recovered at the scene, has been transferred to the FBI laboratory. Not a private lab, not a county facility with limited resources and shifting leadership. The FBI laboratory. With advanced forensic technology. With federal resources. With the kind of institutional focus that does not have a budget ceiling or a staffing limitation or leadership change that can slow it down. The coordination between Pima County and the FBI has been resolved. The evidence is where it needs to be. And here is the part that matters most. The part that changes the calculation entirely for whoever is at the center of this web. The boss cannot reach into an FBI laboratory. There is no version of this where they access what has already been collected and take it back. The hair is there. The DNA is there. The forensic record of what happened on Nancy Guthrie's property is there, locked inside a federal system that does not negotiate, does not slow down, and does not lose interest. That window is gone, and what fills the space where it used to be is something the boss has not faced until now. The full, uninterrupted weight of a federal investigation with the evidence it needs and the time it requires to use it. The behavioral map that Burgess and Brucato and Jordan constructed on May 6 gave investigators something they did not have before. Not just a theory, a map, a detailed, evidence-based picture of how this person thinks, how they move, what they protect, how they have been managing themselves through 3 months of mounting pressure, and where that pressure is most likely to produce a crack. Because cracks happen, not because people are careless. Because pressure is cumulative. Because the performance of ordinary life does not become easier as the scrutiny increases. It becomes harder. Every new development in coverage, every new voice adding to the analysis, every new piece of evidence that edges the investigation closer to the center, adds weight to something that was already heavy. The boss is watching this case. Right now. The same way they have watched it for 3 months. From the inside. From a position that still looks, to most people around them, completely unremarkable. But the audience watching this case has grown. The profilers analyzing it have sharpened their frameworks. The evidence is in federal hands. And the distance between the outer ring of that spiderweb and the center is shorter today than it was on February 1st. If anything in this story connects to something in your immediate world, someone whose behavior shifted after January 31st, someone who reacted with the wrong energy when this case came up, someone whose ordinary life developed a quiet and unexplained tension that was not there before, that feeling you have been carrying has a place to go now. Submit a tip directly through tips.fbi.gov. Contact the Pima County Sheriff's Department. The reward in this case is over $1.2 million. It is unclaimed, and it exists precisely for the moment when one person connects one detail to another and understands what they have been sitting on. 3 months ago, Nancy Guthrie left a family dinner and did not come home. For 3 months, the world looked at one face on one camera and believed that face held the answer. It never did. The answer was always behind it. In someone who planned from a distance. Who executed through someone else. Who, when the exposure of that someone else became too significant to manage, made the kind of decision that only a person with something enormous to lose would make. And in making that decision, they may have believed they severed the last visible connection between themselves and what happened on February 1st. But the hair was already collected. The DNA was already in process. The footage had already been analyzed by people who understood what they were looking at. And the threads, every single one of them, lead to the same center. Dr. Ann Burgess called that person the boss. Dr. Gary Brucato called them a wolf in sheep's clothing. And somewhere right now, that person is sitting inside their ordinary life, watching this case the way they have watched it from the beginning, hoping the threads stop before they reach the center. The FBI is making no such promises. And neither is this investigation. Because the next development in this case is not a theory. It is not a profile. It is a specific name attached to a specific piece of forensic evidence that federal investigators are already working to confirm. The details of what that evidence reveals, and what it connects to inside this investigation, are coming. And when they do, everything that took 3 months to build will finally have a face to put at the center instead of the edge. Subscribe if you are not already here. Because that update is not going to wait for anyone. And you do not want to be the last one to understand where this is going.